"What's the coolest thing your dad did where you knew what he was doing?" And he said, "Never tell mom." I grew up in a fairly rural area with lots of winter, and when my sister and I were little, my dad would take us off-roading in snowy fields, doing donuts and the like with his Suzuki Samurai. One day, he stopped in the middle of a field and got out of the car. Out came a sled and some rope. He tied one end to the sled and the other end to the bumper, and with a gleam in his eye said, "Don't tell mom." He then proceeded to tow us around the field at fairly high speed, doing big figure eights and circles in the powdery snow. So awesome. My dad did this, but since we live in AUS there wasn't snow, so we got the corrugated iron capping that goes along the center line of a roof and folded it in half over a rope. We skied on it over the sand and dirt. When we were doing construction on our house, my dad ended up getting into a huge argument with my mom over the position of a wall. She wanted a larger closet, but he was insistent that it would make the adjacent bathroom too small. He finally gave in and put the wall where she wanted it. The next day when she was at work, he took the day off, knocked out the wall with my uncle, and moved it to where he had wanted to put it originally. Mom never found out. You know, for years after that he had to put up with, "See honey, that wall is in the perfect spot." "Yes dear, good choice." During the Nintendo years, I had a strict early bedtime along with my younger siblings, except on the nights when my mom worked. On those nights, I would be allowed to sneak past my sleeping brother and sister and go downstairs to play Nintendo with my dad until we heard the garage door opening, signaling my mom's return home. At that point, I had to run back to bed and pretend I was sleeping. It was awesome. Same thing, but with my mom. My dad would show up midday Friday at elementary school and tell the teacher I had an appointment or something. We'd actually go fishing for the rest of the day. That's frickin' tea. Your comment brought back memories of my dad taking me out of school to go see Phillies games, etc. I remember one time he took me to a Flyers playoff game and allowed me to skip school the next day, cause we got back so late. I woke up at like 2 p.m. the next day and he took me to a movie. When I was young, 6 or so, I broke my mom's hairdryer to get the electric motor to make a hovercraft boat thing. My mom got really pissed at me. She told my dad and he scolded me a little, but later, when she wasn't watching, he gave me a bucket full of used or broken electronic things, filled with all the motors, wires and parts I could dream of, still working well if you knew how to use them. He said, "Knock yourself out," and gave me a big smile. He also gave me a bunch of batteries. He's an electronic engineer, so I guess he was very proud. I think, for an engineer, there's no prouder moment than the first time your kid breaks something to repurpose usable components. My dad used to smuggle contraband items into Liberia. To this day, I always thought that was kind of cool. I have no idea if my mom knows, but who cares? Liberia cares. When I was 13, my dad let me drive his '84 Cadillac Eldorado about 12 miles home from some family event we had. He sat in the passenger seat and I drove the whole way home. He prefaced asking me if I wanted to drive home by saying, "I saw you playing pole position and you do pretty well. Want to drive the car home?" I could hardly contain myself. 3 towns later, at traffic circle and many intersections and turns, I am putting the car in park in our driveway and my dad is beaming. He looks over and says, "Great job, bud. You might want to wait to tell mom about this." I paused for a second as it sunk in and gave him a big knowing smile. I waited 19 years to tell my mom. Till pole position is an acceptable substitute for an accredited driving school. I didn't have a dad, but there was one BF she had for 5 years that treated me like his own. He was a biker and they both held the policy that if I was going to try drugs, I should do it at home where it's safe. Me smoking pot was no big deal, but she saw LSD as one of the worst things I could do, so of course I had to do it, but not get caught by her. So, one night I was tripping in my room really hard when he knocked on the door. I cracked the door and tried to act normal, but between my giant pupils, permagrin, and the drawings all over my arms, it was obvious to him what was going on. He said he would be right back, and I started having a psychedelic freak out, certain that I was about to be lectured by the matriarch. He came back to my room without knocking, arms full of fun stuff, namely a blacklight, brightly colored poster board, paint, silly putty, a 3D glow-in-the-dark puzzle, pop rocks, a fish CD, and bubbles. He said he would keep her away from my room as long as I wouldn't tell her about his knowledge of my acid use, and especially not about the trip toys he hooked me up with. I found him a few years ago to thank him for being the closest thing to a dad I had ever known. We talked a lot, and on the 5th of May, 2009, his heart simply stopped. I miss him. Acetylene balloon bombs. Set your acetylene torch to the right oxygen acetylene ratio and fill up a big balloon. Stick in a fuse and tie it and stick a 5-gallon bucket above it so you don't blind yourselves. That crap could be heard for miles and miles. The 5-gallon bucket would explode but would mainly shoot straight up in the area like 100 feet and come crashing down. That crap was awesome. Noted. My father had recently come into possession of a Nissan Z32, and I was invited along when he decided to take it for a spin. At the ripe old age of 6, I had never been in a sports car before, at least as far as I could remember. As we cruised down the highway, I asked my father what makes it a sports car. Anyway, I suddenly found myself sinking into the passenger seat as the speedometer easily climbed past 100 miles per hour. After we returned to a same highway speed, he turned to me and said, "Don't tell your mother we did that." This one time, my older brother and I got woken up by my dad at 4 in the morning. Psst, hey, guys, we've had season tickets to Six Flags Magic Mountain, and we still haven't used them. Let's go. Don't tell mom. So we quietly got up, snuck out of the house, into the car, and drove the 6-hour drive down to Southern California. We rode roller coasters all day, then drove home and got back around midnight. My dad's awesome. D. My dad never cursed around our family when I was a kid. My friends still joke that you knew he was P when he called you a knucklehead. Anyway, my dad owns a restaurant, and one day, after he picked me up from school, he got a call from one of his cooks that the prep work for a party that night hadn't gotten done. He let loose a string of profanity that, to this day, I haven't heard duplicated. He turned to me and said, "Sometimes, language like that is appropriate. That doesn't mean anyone needs to know about it." My father wove a tapestry of obscenity that, for all I know, is still hanging in the air somewhere above Lake Michigan. My dad almost crashed his motorcycle on a really beautiful country road he discovered, just going too fast, took a corner too sharp and almost had to drop the bike. The next time he and I were out for a ride, he said, "Don't tell your mother about this, but want to see where I almost died last week?" During my first week in the dorms, I smelled a strange, wonderful, familiar smell wafting down the hall. It took me back to my childhood in Laos, spending afternoons on the porch rolling cigarettes with my dad. I found a classmate and exclaimed that I recognized the smell. Leo tobacco, just like I used to roll for my dad. He looked at me like I was stupid and told me it was marijuana. I immediately called my dad and he fessed up, making me promise not to tell my mom. Dad put a 12-foot ladder on the hood of his car, a Volvo, and had me and my younger brother steady it while he climbed up to get a tennis ball out of the gutter. That's totally okay. Volvos are supposed to be really safe cars. My class was going on a trip to medieval times and I didn't get my permission slip signed to go because I didn't care for medieval times. I had a bad experience, so, realizing that if I went to school that day I would be all alone in a classroom, working, my dad devised a plan. He told me to get in the car, and that we were gonna go somewhere fun. Turned out it was the opening day of The Matrix Reloaded and I was 13. We watched the movie, and then we went out and he bought me Enter the Matrix for GamerCube. I know a lot of people are going to say I can't believe you passed up medieval times for a Matrix sequel and a crappy game. But believe me, it was worth it because it was worth both things. Spending time with my dad. I would like to know what this bad experience was. I used to go fishing with my dad every weekend, and every time we hit a certain stretch of road he would put the pedal to the metal and hit 100 plus. He always said, "Never tell your mom or she will never let go fishing again." This lasted until my brother was old enough to join us without needing too much supervision. Unfortunately, the first time the speedometer went over 100, he blabbed, so ended my weekend fishing trips. Well, for a few weeks anyway. When my dad had to give up racing several years ago, SCCA, he had his E-Class Porsche 914 race engine installed in his daily driver 914. Best don't tell mom ever. Your dad is awesome. My dad said that if my stepmother beat him in a game of bowling, he would buy me Pokemon Gold. He sabotaged his own game so well no one could tell, and I loved that game. I'm sure he's still telling himself that. My brother, dad and I were disc golfing at our local course, inside city limits, and my brother decides to shoot off about $200 worth of fireworks. Turns out the show and sounds were so loud that some of the city softball games stopped to admire. We saw a cop car pull up and immediately my dad picks the two of us up and sprints about a mile to the softball games and we blend into the crowd. This is my favorite never tell mom story. My dad would take me to this log cabin twice a week, late at night. It was in the middle of nowhere. There, him and these random guys would play poker till dawn. My mom worked nights as a nurse, so I would have to accompany him twice a week on these poker nights. Seriously, he and these old timers, country bumfucks all of them, played all dang night in this one room cabin in the woods. I watched, or read, or slept, and dad would drop me at school in the morning. Mom never knew, and I learned a skill. Early 90s, my South African mom used to work at grocery store here in Canada and had the most ridiculously racist manager. One day she misplaced some products on the shelves while my dad and I were just getting into the store when we hear her freaking manager yelling at my mom. I was like 5 at the time or something. I kid you not. He actually said, "What the frick is wrong with you? Huh? Did all that sun in Africa just bake your freaking brain or something? Stupid freaking third world B." At this point, my dad was in the other aisle just freaking seething. My mom runs off crying, and that's when my dad came to have a nice chat with the manager. My dad's 6'7" and a 5th degree black belt in Taekwondo. Anyways, he walks over to the manager who was unaware of who he was and just says, "You know, that wasn't a very nice thing to say." The manager looks my dad right in the eyes and says, "These N are just too freaking stupid to understand a simple order." The next part is something that makes me smile even as I'm writing this. My dad grabs the guy, throws him into this huge shelf and tells that butthole manager he's got one of the best lawyers in the area and he'll have my mom sue the store for everything they have if the manager has the audacity to press charges for assault. Hearing all the commotion, my mom came back and said, "What's going on?" Dad takes her by the arm, walks out all cool hand Luke and says, "Your boss fell. I got a raise, and you quit your job. That's what's going on, dear." Most freaking badass thing I've seen him do. To this day my mom thinks her manager just fell into a shelf on his own. One day my dad walked into my kitchen wielding some bloody paper towels, a pair of pliers, and a recently dislodged tooth in his hand. Don't tell mom. Easily the most hardcore thing he has ever done. I was around 12. My brother was 10. We're sitting in the basement watching television when my father comes down and proclaims that he has a movie that we're going to love. He says it's called A Clockwork Orange. We're game. He throws the VHS into the player and about a minute in my mother walks down, sees the television, and yells, "No, no, absolutely not." She grabs it out of the VCR and says, "I'm going to bed, and I'm taking this with me." My brother and I sigh in dejection, and my father follows suit. My mother goes upstairs. We slide off the couch to go elsewhere when my father says, "Wait, not so fast," and from under his sweater, pulls out another copy. I planned for this. Don't tell your mother. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen this movie. I think it's sort of obscure. Without going into detail, my mother, as it turns out, was probably justified in trying to keep us from watching it. I think it was a couple of weeks before my mum and stepdad got married. The girls went away for a bachelorette weekend thing, so the guys took all us kids with them camping and fishing. My stepdad taught 5-year-old me how to water ski by dragging me around really fast in the shallows. I was getting pretty good, so they let me have a go on the back of the boat. He made me swear not to tell my mum. I didn't, and she was pretty impressed a couple of years later when we went away skiing and I was really good at it first go haha. Back in 2007, my dad and I went to a RATN concert at Alpine Valley. Frick yeah, and as we were walking out, a girl go up on a table and started stripping. We egged her on. Pretty awesome. Like 10 days before Halo 2 came out, there was an event in DC that Bungie was holding where you could come and play it. Being like 13 at the time, I couldn't go by myself and my mom wouldn't take me. She hates violent video games. Well, at the last second my dad tells me and my two brothers to jump in the car because we're going to go to that video game thing. Halo 2 completely confused him and he must have been bored out of his mind, but he stayed the entire 2-3 hours with us, and then he took us to Taco Bell afterwards. Best day ever. Dang, I was going to say you must be pretty young to be only 13 when Halo 2 came out, but it turns out it released 7 years ago, which makes you a year older than me. Frick, time flies by fast. He woke me up throwing a ball of black clothing at me at 3 AM one night, then had me break into the local dry cleaners via being dropped into the big mail slot for dirty suits. He had a bunch of company shirts for his sales team that were flying out early the next morning to some expo before the cleaners opened there, and unlocking the door for him. Of course he left a note and sufficient funds and some. He was later arrested, though I believe everything was sorted out somehow. Dad. Back in the late 80s, the Sierra adventure games were all the rage. My older brother and I were probably around the ages of 10 and 8 and we played all the games except Leisure Suit Larry. Our parents wouldn't let us. Of course my dad played it all the time in the evenings. My brother and I would sneak into the computer room and hide in the back of the room while he played. While my dad never said never tell mom, he would just pretend that we weren't in the room and would let us watch as he fricked the prostitute without a condom on, causing him to get an STD and die. My dad was freaking awesome, but he died of cancer a few years later. So frick cancer. For some reason my dad let me play Leisure Suit Larry all the time. He'd even answer the pop culture questions at the beginning for me. Thing is, I was born in 1987, so I was like 3 or 4. This was more of just a fun prank. My mom had just gotten a new license in the mail. Before she saw it, my dad and I covered her picture with one of her that water had dropped on. The replacement picture was all warped and made her look like a monster. He told me not to say anything. It was hilarious when she opened that envelope, but she freaked out and I felt really bad, so I confessed. You see, that's why your dad didn't think you were cool. One day my dad and I were at McDonald's and there was a lady who was obviously homeless. She was just drinking coffee in a slow way, and you could tell she savored every sip. My dad went and bought her a gift certificate and handed it to her. She immediately went and bought some food to go with her coffee. It wasn't purposely hidden from my mom, but for some reason we always kept it as our secret. Now whenever I can, I keep fast food gift cards on me to give to anyone homeless instead of money. He also let me climb on the roof of our house with him, even though it would have freaked my mom out. Altruism is true when you don't tell anyone else. It was probably a lesson in helping people to help them, and not for the bragging rights. In lieu of giving me the talk, as mom had been nagging him to do, he just showed me how to clear the history on IE and left it at that. A mutually beneficial move on his part. Growing up, we lived in a small town in rural Colorado. As such, we grew up with guns and hunting. One day, my dad was showing my brother and I how to clean a gun safely. It was just a cheap Mullen .22, a small gun if you're not familiar. Anyway, he empties out the magazine and then manually cycles the action several times to make sure it's empty. He then says, "Now that it's empty, you have to release the firing pin." He follows all safety procedures and points it away from everyone and towards the floor, and casually pulls the trigger. The gun goes off, ricochets off the baseboard heater, and through the wall into the closet and lodges in a box of his old files. He casually looks up at both of us and says, "That's why you never point a gun at anyone, even when it's not loaded." He was so calm, we almost thought he'd done it on purpose to prove a point, but then he said, "Let's not tell your mom about this." I wasn't there and didn't know about this until after the fact, but it's still relevant. Out of the blue, my dad was recently arrested and put in jail for a few hours for some weird business fraud charge. I was shocked and called him right in after he got released, and he agreed to tell me the whole story under the condition that I never tell mom. My dad told me he had borrowed some money, like $10,000, from a friend that he was unable to pay back as quickly as the friend would have liked, because he's had unexpected medical issues that have cost lots of $. So, one day, when he was getting into his car, 3 huge Russian dudes cornered my dad as he was getting into his car. They mentioned the debt and the fact that my dad needed to pay up. One of the guys had a bat and informed him they were there to give him a tune-up. My dad told me when that they advanced on him he pulled out a gun that he keeps hidden under his car seat. He said he cocked the gun and was ready to use it. I guess that was enough for them, as they left him alone. A few weeks later he was charged with fraud and arrested. I guess the mafia goons decided that dying over $10K wasn't worth it and the friend decided to then trump up some charges against him and go to the police. The police interviewed him. He didn't mention the incident above, and they decided that it was entirely a personal matter and dropped the charge. He hasn't seen nor heard from the friend or mob since. I never even knew he owned a gun, and mom sure as heck doesn't know either. TL. DR. Dad won a showdown W mafia goons. The mob got your dad's friend for not paying fast enough. Not something my father did, but we made cookies a few days ago and I gave my daughter, who just turned 5, a cookie before we ate dinner and she had a huge smile until I jokingly said don't tell mommy. She frowned and put the cookie back. When I asked her why she said she didn't want to lie, I told her she is amazing, gave her a hug, and 2 cookies. I was so proud. We then went and told her mother all about it. D. Probably too late, but 1994 I was 13 and living with my mother. Spent every other weekend with my dad. My mother was of the anything fun is bad school, and anything fun with dad is reason to call the cops on child endangerment charges school. Dad's son from his first marriage was in the airborne, and based about 8 hours away. One weekend he picked me up on a Friday night, and after about an hour of driving I noticed we weren't going to his house. Early Saturday morning we pull up to the front gates of featuring Poke. W went to the barracks where my brother had a bunch of jump gear in my size waiting for me. Made my first solo jump courtesy of Uncle Sam at 6:30 AM that day with older bro and his team. Weekend of explosives and automatics weapons ensued. Slight problem. Burned my hand on a hot cooling sleeve on a squad weapon. After a quick talk, it was decided that I burned my hand on a motorcycle exhaust, followed by, don't tell your mom. If you do, I'll go to jail and these guys will cut you up and feed you to the alligators. My dad bought really big fireworks in Mexico. The next time we went to California, he wanted to set them off on the beach. Of course, this is illegal in California. He did it anyway, and the cops came. That was the first time I ever ran from the cops with my dad. When we got away, he told me not to tell my mom. Growing up my dad was active duty Air Force and he was gone a lot TDY, so my mom, sisters and I didn't see him regularly. One day I was called out of my 4th grade class because my parent was there to take me to my medical appointment. Turns out dad was back in town, and he took me and my sister to the base, took us shopping and bought me Donkey Kong Country for the SNES. Best school day ever. My father and I were driving in the snow when I was about 6. And he did a donut in an intersection. I thought it was great, but he said now don't tell your mother. That was the only time he ever did that with me, but for the rest of my life I've done donuts whenever it snows. Instead of don't tell your mother, he should have said, you'll never forget this, and probably do it whenever possible. At one point, when I was like 19 or 20, my father would make me swear not to tell my mom or my brother we toked together, because he agreed to quit if she stopped with cigarettes, and my brother had no idea my dad toked. My mother would make me swear not to tell my father or brother that we smoked cigarettes together, because of what she agreed with my dad, and because she said she would quit smoking cigarettes if my brother would try to lose weight on a diet. All the while my brother makes me swear up and down not to tell my mother or father he is sneaking epic amounts of junk food, because he doesn't want to hear their crap. True story. Great family. I love em. I believe you are what is called an enabler. Anytime we go out and he buys me drinks at the bar, he is 70, and I am 22, let me tell you, he is the epitome of you are only as old as you feel. My dad told me you're only as old as the women you feel. When I was 16 my dad signed for me to get a tattoo. When my mom eventually found out she almost divorced him, she was so pee. Good times. Not as a kid, actually not till I was 20. We went to my beach house for a spring break trip and both my parents made me promise not to let any girls stay with us. We came up with a couple of lies about who was coming and eventually went to the condo with about 8 guys and 6 girls. Already said no more than 8 people could come. We kept the place pretty much under control and nothing went wrong during the trip. A couple of days after we got back, I was talking to my dad on the phone and he told me, "I'm sure you invited whoever you wanted and drank the whole time. I won't tell your mom. Hope you all had a good trip. Pretty cool of him. Also, I'm glad my dad isn't as stupid as I thought." If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.